So today, in the ordinary form, the first reading is from the Acts of the Apostles. And in the first reading, Paul gets to Antioch in Pisidian Antioch. He goes to the synagogue and he basically preaches how salvation history is completed in our Lord Jesus Christ. That we ourselves, he has come to proclaim the good news to them, that what God promised to our fathers, he has brought to fulfillment for us, their children, by raising up Jesus, as it is written in the second psalm, "You are my son, this day I have begotten you." This idea, this fundamental idea, to all Paul's preaching, to all the apostles' preaching, that everything God has done, everything God has revealed, comes to its fullness in the passion, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. That the incarnation and the passion are the center of all things, and through which we are saved. And our Lord, in the Gospel today from St. John, it's where he says one of my favorite passages. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And so St. Thomas talks about this a little bit, probably in a number of places, but here I'm thinking of one thing in particular. It's pretty obvious, I think, to see how our Lord is the truth, because he's God, and God is, of course, the foundation and the fullness of truth. And of course, especially our Lord as the Logos, as that word spoken, which, he is truth being expressed, both in the internal life of the Trinity, in that kind of psychological analogy, and also in the fact that through the incarnation, he has come to us to reveal everything his Father desires him to reveal to us. And he's the life, and that, he draws plenty of parallels to that. Certainly, the vine and the branches is one, and Paul will use this to talk about how the Gentiles are saved by being grafted on to that branch that is Christ, that is God, that is God's people of Israel. That grafting on it through Christ, because as the branch gives life, as the branch receives life from the vine, so we receive life from our Lord. But the way Thomas speaks about how he is the way in a certain sense, he says that I'm going to quote this. The humanity of Christ is the way by which we come to the divinity. That is to say, so there's a lot going on there. Of course, that through his sacred humanity, he makes himself known to us. And so we come to realize he is God through what he did with his sacred humanity. That's how St. Thomas Aquinas, his namesake, St. Thomas the Apostle, can say when he sees our risen Lord with his wounds, he can say, "My Lord and my God." He sees the man, but he confesses divinity. Because through the resurrection, through that presence of Christ in his glory after the resurrection, St. Thomas the Apostle is able to come to know his divinity. But this is also true in the life of the Church, that through the sacred humanity of Christ, through his ascension to heaven as being seated at the Father's right hand, he sends the Spirit, which is the life of the Church, the soul of the Church. He gives us, through the power of that Spirit on the Church, he gives us the sacraments through which we are able to receive his grace. So that is through his entire passion, death, and resurrection, through the fullness of that Paschal mystery, which is eternal. If we're using Hebrews to understand this, the fullness of this is in the ascension, because the sacrifice offered, the blood, and it's taken into the Holy of Holies. And since he's there forever, this sacrifice is an eternal sacrifice, always effective. And so we can always be giving a participation in that sacrifice. The Spirit is always being sent upon the Church to empower her with the sacramental, to be obedient to the Lord by living the sacramental rites, to baptize as he told us, to anoint as he told us, to impart the Spirit as he told us, and all those things. And of course, most especially in the Eucharist, which in a quite literal way, the humanity of Christ, made present under the sacramental signs of bread and wine, makes present his divinity, because we receive his body, blood, and his soul, the fullness of his humanity. And so because those are united eternally to the Godhead, to the second person of the Blessed Trinity, to that divine person, we also receive his divinity, and therefore receive through the Eucharist divine life. Now that might be a little hard to think about in this circumstance of the pandemic, where, in a lot of cases we're not able to attend Mass regularly. But I think here is where we also need to recognize something else important. An idea, I'm going to use the phrasing of the Second Vatican Council. This is certainly not in any way foreign to St. Thomas. And you can Google my name and you can read a whole paper about that I wrote to get my Master's of Arts in Theology, if you really want to be bored. Or I go more in depth, but I wrote it, so you'll be bored anyway. But this idea that all the sacraments come from the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is making present that in an unbloody manner, the sacrifice of Christ. Because remember, in the kind of understanding in Hebrews, the ascension is him going to the Holy of Holies. That's the completion of the sacrifice where the blood is sprinkled in the Holy of Holies. And that's eternal because he's forever at the right hand of the Father. And so his sacrifice never ends, and therefore what was a temporal event in the cross and the resurrection is also an event that echoes through all eternity, because it is also an event that ends in heaven in that Holy of Holies not made by human hands, and therefore it can be instantiated at any time in history, right? Using what Christ has given us to commemorate, to make a memorial, which is even in Old Testament ways something more than just remembering, but is a certain making present. That's why if you, for example, were a proselyte, a convert to Judaism, you were still part of the people saved at the Red Sea because you took part in the Passover. That night was the same night. In the current ritual that's celebrated, actually, that comes that question: once we were slaves and now we are free, how is this night not like any other night? Why do we eat when we recline? Because we were slaves and now we're free. This idea that you are the people God saved, right? And this goes back to the Passover that our Lord was celebrated, right? And that transformation of that Passover meal is that transformation of the event that saves us, that is made present. And why were we slaves to sin and death, and now we are free? Because the Mass, or more properly, because the Mass is making present that same sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And so the reality that everything comes from that, all the sacraments come from that, and all the sacraments direct us to the Eucharist as well, because all the sacraments direct us to communion with God, which is the most perfect way of that available in this life, is through the Eucharist, where we receive God not just in his grace, but in his incarnate self, in his body, blood, soul, and divinity. Well, the reality of that then is that whilst acts of spiritual communion are not the same as receiving the Eucharist, because God will give us the grace there. God can give us the grace that we would, of the same grace he gives in the Eucharist, but we're not receiving the sacramental presence of Christ into us. Nonetheless, spiritual communion is a real way of receiving that grace, because by our baptisms and we are ordered to the reception of the Eucharist. One is baptized to be a part of the church, to enter into divine worship, and therefore to enter into it at its fullness, which is the worthy reception of the Eucharist, right? That the Mass includes the consumption of the sacrifice, because the sacrifice was consumed, and that is necessarily done in the priest, but may also be done in the faithful, and is encouraged to be done in the faithful when they're present and prepare properly disposed to receive. And so the reality is in that reception of Holy Communion is that foretaste of the eternal banquet of the Lamb. And while even when we can't receive that, we're still ordered to receiving that, and therefore an act of spiritual communion when we can't attend Mass like we can right now, or might not be able to when we're sick, or even if we regularly go to daily Mass, but our job changes and we can't go to daily Mass like we used to do, to make that prayer of spiritual communion. And also even if we're at Mass, we're at an obligatory Mass, but we weren't able to get to confession, and we don't believe ourselves properly disposed to receive the Eucharist unless we confess, and so we won't be able to receive this weekend. Nonetheless, that act of spiritual communion, asking the Lord to give us the grace in our lives, is very real, because our baptism orders us to that. St. Thomas will talk about that very explicitly in questions related, I think, especially to the Eucharist and the baptism in the third part, because the question is, well, like, if you're baptized, is that enough to be saved? What if you're baptized and you die before receiving the Eucharist? But our Lord says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And St. Thomas very explicitly answers that the Eucharist is ordered to the reception of the Eucharist. And so a barrier between the baptized person not being able to receive the Eucharist is only an issue for salvation if that barrier exists because the baptized person puts it up themselves. If they refuse to receive the Eucharist, or if they or things like that. But if circumstances don't let you do that, you're still ordered to it, and you can still receive that grace from God, because that's the whole point of the baptism, is to make you a member of his people, to make you part of his church, so you can be ordered to receiving the Eucharist. So I think that one thing that I hope comes out of this very difficult and time, and certainly not one that any of us enjoy, not a circumstance any of us want, and one we want to be over quickly, but something that I hope that God draws out of this, working all things to the good of those who love him, is bringing back to the Catholic consciousness the power of spiritual communion, of being able to make that communion if you're at Mass, but for whatever reason you can't receive. You didn't make the fast, you haven't been able to get to confession, or to be able to make it on days where you might not be able to go to Mass because you're sick, because your schedule has changed, so daily Mass is now not something that you can do every day, but to at least make that prayer of spiritual communion, so that you can ask God to keep giving you that grace, the grace that the Eucharist would bring. And because our Lord is merciful, and because our Lord is generous and desires to give us life, and give us life in abundantly, he will give us that grace, so that we can be sustained until the next time comes, when we can receive the Eucharist, receive the Eucharist itself, and receive both the grace and the sacramental presence of our Lord entering into our lives through his body, blood, soul, and divinity made present in the most blessed sacrament. As always, I'm remembering you in my prayers and my masses. Please stay safe out there. Say an Ave for me if you get the chance. And always remember that God is in control.